Yeah, another indication of just how important it is to come to some kind of ceasefire. And for more on that, we're going to be joined by Victor Gao. He is in Chengdu, China today. Victor, of course, is the chair professor at Soochow University. Victor, always a pleasure. Good to see you.
Thank you very much for having me.
An important time. This is the first time that President Xi Jinping and Zelensky have spoken since this conflict began. Tell me why it is so important that it's happening now and how to build on that 12-point plan that China unveiled a few months back.
Thank you very much for having me. Indeed, the 1-hour-long phone call between Chinese President Xi Jinping and the Ukrainian President Zelensky is very important, not only for the substance, but also for the symbolism, as well as for the timing. On the other hand, allow me to emphasize one point, that is, China and Ukraine have maintained very close and high-ranking channels of communication with each other between the two governments, the two military, two securities operations, for example, and there has never been any interruption of the communication between the two sides. And I think both China and Ukraine have been discussing in private a way to proceed with either a summit meeting, a summit phone call, or a video conference for quite some time. And on the Chinese side, China prefers discussions behind the scene in privacy, for example, in confidence. And China normally would not really release anything until there is a very firm, solid announcement to be made. This time, it is the same case. The two leaders talk to each other, and I think this phone call definitely will boost mutual confidence and mutual trust. And it is exactly against the time when the war in Ukraine should really be brought to an end as quickly as possible through diplomacy and discussions rather than the continuation of the war. I think the fact that China has proposed the only peace proposal for ending the war in peace and diplomacy really means a lot, not only for Ukraine, but also for Russia, as well as all the parties concerned in this war. China's emphasis is on no nuclear war at all, because otherwise the war in Ukraine will escalate into a global calamity for all people in the world.
Exactly. It could spiral out of control very quickly. I think it's also worth pointing out that China and Ukraine met in January, just before this conflict began, and recognizing the 30 years that the two nations had in diplomatic relations. If there is something to be pointed out from the West, which we hear so often, the West kind of trying to read between the lines on everything going on. And one thing we've heard, that China does have close relations with Moscow, always has, and just recently President Xi was in Moscow speaking with Vladimir Putin. What do you make of this, when the West tries to basically deconstruct what's going on, read between the lines, and perhaps say more is at play here?
First of all, allow me to emphasize one point. I personally would say I will not be surprised, and I hope nobody will pretend to be surprised, if eventually there will be a face-to-face summit meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and the Ukrainian President Zelensky, somewhere, whether it will be in Beijing, in Kyiv, or in another country's capital, that's yet to be finalized. But a face-to-face meeting between these two leaders will be utmostly important. Now, on the other hand, China prefers to use diplomacy and behind-the-scene negotiations to bring the war to an end. It's very different from some other countries which want to continue the war and continue to pour more fuel onto the fire, as if, for example, there will be no further consequences. As I emphasize, what China concerns the most, the biggest evil out of this war may be the nuclear escalation. We need to do whatever we can to prevent that from happening, to prevent that from gathering momentum, and peaceful negotiation to wrap up this war, to end the war, is the only viable solution right now. And I do hope all the other countries will really calm down and listen very carefully to what China has to present, and eventually support China's peaceful effort in bringing the war to an end.
You know, Victor, one other thing that came out after this discussion in diplomatic channels discussing what was going on, and China pointed out that it has not sold weapons, it has not taken advantage of, as was said earlier, of making money off of this conflict, where the U.S. and other nations are obviously supplying Ukraine with a great deal of military hardware. What do you make of that?
Well, China's position has been consistent. That is, China does not pick any side in this war. China urges peace and diplomacy, and China does not profit from, let's say, selling weapons or any other things to one party versus the other. This is not only the consistent policy for China since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine about 1 year ago. This has also been the consistent policy China has been following, involving other conflicts, other military confrontations or wars in many parts of the world. This really demonstrates the high level of decency, the morality, the legitimacy, and all the other things positive for China. China follows a high ground, that is, to promote peace, to promote diplomacy. And I hope other countries which are really acting on the spur of the moment will adopt a longer perspective to look at the very complicated situation involving the war in Ukraine, and also to really make any decision proceeding from the fundamental interest of the Ukrainian people first. That is, no more deaths of the civilians in Ukraine, and the better settlement of the prisoners of war of both sides, leading eventually to their exchanges, and ceasefire, ceasefire, ceasefire. That's the most important thing in the next step, peaceful discussion and negotiations.
Well, Victor Gao, was an important 1-hour phone call. We greatly appreciate your insight, and we hope, as you say, that the two sides do have face-to-face meetings in perhaps the near future. Victor Gao, always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.